The lawyer didn't even look up when he handed me the envelope. He just slid it across the table like it was a grocery receipt. And when I opened it and saw what was inside, a single folded dollar bill and an address written in my father's handwriting, the whole room laughed. My ex-wife's attorney actually covered his mouth. My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair like a man who'd just won something. I didn't laugh. I just sat there with that dollar bill in my hand, reading the address. And I thought, my father never did anything without a reason. If you've ever been handed something that looked like nothing, stay with me, because this is about what was buried underneath. And if stories like this pull at something deep in you, subscribe. You won't regret what's coming. Let me take you back to where this started. 14 months before that reading, I was sleeping in my truck. Not as a metaphor. Not as a dramatic way of saying things were hard. I mean, I was actually sleeping in a 2009 Silverado with a cracked passenger window, parked behind the lot of a gas station off Route 9 in Grover County, Missouri. The heater worked about half the time. The other half, I wore both flannel shirts I owned and pulled a moving blanket over my shoulders until morning came. My name is Eli Marsh. I was 43 years old. I had a daughter I was allowed to see on alternate weekends. I had $1,700 in a checking account that had once held more than I could spend. I had a set of carpenter's tools in the truck bed and a reputation for being a man who used to be something. The divorce had taken 3 years. It had taken the house, most of what I'd built, and a version of myself I still haven't fully made peace with. I'm not going to tell you it was entirely her fault. Grief does things to a marriage. When our son Marcus died, he was 9, it was a car accident. 4 years before the divorce, something cracked in our foundation that we never fully repaired. We just kept laying new carpet over the crack and pretending the floor was solid. It wasn't, and when it finally gave out, everything fell through. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it so you understand who I was when my father's lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning in October and told me that Raymond Marsh had passed away in his sleep at 78 years old, and that I was listed in his will. I hadn't spoken to my father in 6 years. The last conversation we had was at Marcus's funeral. He'd said something about strength, about keeping it together. I'd told him to leave. He did. Neither of us called after. So when David Fenn, my father's attorney, said my name was in the will, I felt something complicated. Not grief exactly. More like the ghost of grief, the outline of a feeling I'd already mourned and boxed up. I drove 3 hours to Fenn's office in a small town called Hester Bluff. I sat in a waiting room with yellow walls and a dying fern near the window. And then I walked into the reading. There were 6 people in that room. My half-brother Curtis, who my father had with a woman he married after my mother left. Curtis had done well, owned 2 auto repair shops, lived in a brick house, wore a watch that cost more than my truck. He sat with his arms folded and didn't look at me. Curtis's wife, Karen, who had the kind of smile that functions as a wall. 2 of my father's neighbors, listed as minor beneficiaries, there to collect a lawnmower and a storage unit of farm tools. My ex-wife's attorney, who was there purely because Diane had sent him to observe in case any of the inheritance was subject to outstanding settlement claims. And me. David Fenn read the will in the flat, careful voice of a man who has learned not to become emotionally involved in other people's financial pain. Curtis received the house. The contents of the house. A savings account with $214,000 in it. 2 vehicles. The mineral rights to a parcel of land in neighboring Calver County. I watched Curtis pretend not to look pleased. Fenn cleared his throat. To my son Elias Raymond Marsh, the property located at rural Route 7, County Road 44, Hester Bluff, Missouri, known locally as the Doyle Farmhouse, and the sum of $1. He slid the envelope across the table. That's when the room laughed. The Doyle farmhouse. I'd heard that name exactly once in my life years ago, my father mentioning it in passing, something about buying it off a family that moved west. I'd never seen it, never thought about it. Curtis leaned over and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, didn't even know the old man still owned that wreck. Been condemned for years. You're gonna need a tetanus shot just to walk to the front door. I took the dollar bill. I folded it into my shirt pocket. David Fenn caught my eye across the table. His expression didn't change, but something in it said, come back after. I waited until everyone left. Fenn locked the door and poured 2 cups of coffee I didn't ask for and set one in front of me. He said, your father asked me to tell you something when we were alone. He said, and these are his exact words, tell you the land knows the difference between someone who stays and someone who leaves. I stared at the coffee. That's all. That's all he told me to say. Fenn slid a key across the table. Hold iron. The kind that unlocks something built before anyone worried about convenience. A strip of yellowed tape wrapped around the bowl with 2 letters written in blue ink, M. My initials. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. Front door. I asked. Front door, Fenn said. He also asked me to drive you there personally. In the morning, if you're willing. I slept in my truck in Fenn's parking lot that night. The farmhouse sat at the end of a half-mile gravel track that had mostly returned to nature. We drove in Fenn's sedan, branches scraping the sides, weeds tall enough to brush the windows. It was early November. The sky was the color of old pewter. The trees had gone bare and were reaching across the lane like the arms of things that had been waiting a long time. When the house came into view, I understood why the room had laughed. It was 2 stories, clapboard siding, once white, now the gray-brown of weathered bone. The front porch had partially collapsed. A second-floor window was open and something, pigeons maybe, had been nesting in the gap. The land around it was overgrown, fields of dead grass, and thistles stretching in every direction, broken by a few skeletal oaks and what had once been a fence line. A barn stood about 200 feet behind the house. Its roof had partially caved on one side. The doors hung open. Inside, from the car, I could see the dark outline of an old tractor, rusted to stillness. Fenn put the car in park and said nothing. I got out. The key fit. The door swung inward with a groan that felt ancient and personal, like the house was exhaling something it had been holding for a long time. Inside smelled like coal and something older, dried wood and clay and the particular silence of rooms that haven't been breathed in for years. Dust moved in the pale light that fell through the dirty windows. The entry hall had a staircase along the right wall. Straight ahead, a kitchen. To the left, a sitting room with a stone fireplace and 2 chairs that had been there so long they'd started to become part of the floor. On the mantel of the fireplace, a photograph. I walked toward it. It was my father, young, mid-30s maybe, before I was born, standing in front of this house. But the house in the photograph was clean white. The porch was intact. He had his hand on the shoulder of a man I didn't recognize, older, thin, with the look of someone who had worked outside his entire life. My father was smiling. I had almost never seen my father smile. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my father's handwriting, 1978. The year Doyle saved the line. I had no idea what that meant. I set it back on the mantel. Outside, I heard Fenn's car start and slowly pull back down the lane. He'd told me he'd return in 3 days. I was alone. I slept the first night in the sitting room. I had a sleeping bag in the truck, a camp lantern, 2 days of food in a grocery bag, bread, peanut butter, a box of crackers, 2 cans of soup. I built a fire in the fireplace using wood from the collapsed section of the porch. The chimney drew well, which surprised me. Whatever else had fallen apart in this house, someone had built that chimney right. The wind came in through the gaps in the walls. I could hear it moving through the rooms above me, a low moan that shifted in pitch as the night deepened. I told myself it was just a house. I didn't sleep well. By the second morning, I was already finding things. Not treasure. Not anything obvious. Just things that didn't add up. The kitchen floorboards were uneven, not from age exactly, but in a deliberate pattern. 3 boards near the back corner were newer than the rest. The wood was lighter, the grain different. Someone had replaced them. Not out of rot, because when I crouched and looked closely, the boards beneath were still solid. Someone had replaced them for another reason. I didn't pull them up. Not yet. In the sitting room, behind one of the old chairs, I found marks on the wall. Pencil marks, barely visible. Numbers, and what looked like initials, RN. My father's initials, next to a date, October 14th, 1989. The year I was 10 years old. My father had been in this house when I was 10 years old, and he had never once mentioned it to me. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found a trunk, locked. No keyhole I could see, a padlock on the hasp, rusted shut. I left it, and in the barn, when I finally pushed the heavy doors fully open and let the gray morning light flood in, I found something that stopped me cold. Crates. Old wooden crates, a dozen of them, stacked along the far wall and covered with canvas tarps. I pulled one corner of canvas back. The crates were sealed. Stenciled on the side, in black paint, faded but legible, Marshland Survey Calver CO 1979 to 1991. Survey crates. In a barn. On land my father left me for $1. I called Fen from the property line where I could get a single bar of signal. What was my father surveying out here for 12 years? A pause. I don't know, Eli. That's not something he shared with me. Curtis got the mineral rights to the Calver County parcel. Is this land, this farmhouse land, is it in Calver County? A longer pause. No. The farmhouse sits in Hester County. The county line runs approximately 800 yards east of the barn. 800 yards. What about underground? I said. Geology. Anything below the surface here, any record? Eli, Fen said, carefully, I think you should look at what's in those crates before you ask me questions I can't answer. He hung up. If you've ever been the one people underestimated, the one they handed the dollar while someone else got the deed to the real thing, subscribe. These stories are written for you. Not for the people who won the room. For the ones who stayed quiet and kept digging. I spent the better part of day 3 prying open crates. Inside, rolled survey maps, dozens of them, geological cores, narrow tubes of extracted earth labeled by depth, grid charts, handwritten field notes in my father's precise, small handwriting. I spread the maps across the barn floor. They covered the farmhouse property in extraordinary detail: soil composition, water table depth, rock layer designations, elevation contours, 12 years of survey work, meticulous, obsessive. And on one map, the one dated 1991, the most recent one, a section had been circled in red ink, not the barn, not the house, a point in the field, roughly 200 feet south of the barn. Marked with a single notation, confirmed -34 feet, RMM, Raymond Michael Marsh, my father. Confirmed what? The storm came that night. I'd felt it building through the afternoon, pressure dropping, the temperature falling fast, the sky turning the particular shade of green-gray that means a system is moving in hard. By nightfall, rain was hammering the roof. A section of the upstairs gave up a leak that ran down the interior stairwell wall. Lightning came in sheets. I sat next to the fireplace with the survey map spread on the floor around me and read every note my father had written. Most of it was technical, depths, compositions, percentages. But between the field notes, occasionally, he wrote other things, thoughts, observations. Things a man writes when he's alone in a field and needs somewhere to put what he's thinking. March 3, 1983. 14 inches below topsoil. The clay shifts to something older. I've never seen anything like this in Hester County. Doyle knew. He always knew. He's why I bought this land and why I've never sold it. November 1st, 1987. Curtis doesn't know I'm here. He doesn't need to. What's underneath this ground is not for someone who only understands what things are worth. It's for someone who can understand what things mean. I read that line 3 times. What's underneath this ground is not for someone who only understands what things are worth. The fire cracked and shifted. Outside, lightning turned the cracked windows white for half a second. I thought about the kitchen floor, the replaced boards, the confirmed marking on the 1991 map, 200 feet south of the barn. I put on my coat. The rain hit me like a wall the moment I stepped off the porch. I had the camp lantern and a steel spade I'd found hanging in the barn. The ground was already turning to mud. I walked the 200 feet by counting my steps in the dark, the lantern cutting a pale orange circle in the downpour. I found the spot. Or rather, the spot found me. Because when I swept the lantern low over the ground, I saw it, a slight depression in the earth, maybe 3 feet across, in a near-perfect circle. The kind of depression that happens when something underground shifts or settles. I started digging. 30 minutes, 40. The rain didn't stop. The mud sucked at the spade. At 14 inches, the blade hit wood. I cleared the mud off by hand, a hatch. Old wood, iron banded, set flush into the earth, a hasp. And on the hasp, a padlock. New. Stainless steel. A combination lock. I stood there in the rain with mud on my arms up to my elbows. A combination lock. New. My father had put a new lock on something buried in a field he left me for $1. I thought about the strip of tape on the iron key. My initials. The key was for the front door. This lock needed a combination. I went back inside. I stood in the sitting room dripping, and I looked at the photograph on the mantel. I turned it over. 1978. The year Doyle saved the line. I looked at the pencil marks on the wall. My father's initials. The date, October 14th, 1989. October 14th. His birthday. I went back into the rain. I tried October 14th, 89. The lock opened. I want to tell you what I found in a way that does it justice, because standing at the top of that wooden ladder, lantern in hand, rain hammering my shoulders, looking down into the dark, I understood for the first time that my father had been trying to tell me something his whole life. He just hadn't known how to say it in words. So he'd buried it instead. The space below was dry. Stone-lined walls, carefully built, not poured concrete but cut stone, old work, the kind done by someone who intended it to last 100 years. Roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. Ceiling about 6.5 feet high, I could stand straight. Along the walls, shelves. And on the shelves, in sealed metal cases, in oilcloth bundles, in glass jars with rubber gaskets, documents. records.deeds, land surveys, geological reports, core sample analyses signed by an independent geological firm dated 1992. And at the center of the room, a single wooden table. On the table, a letter, sealed. My name on the front in my father's handwriting. I picked it up. I sat down on the stone floor. I opened it. My hands were shaking. I want to be honest about that. The letter was 4 pages. I won't read you every word. Some of it is mine alone. But I'll tell you what it said. My father had bought the Doyle farmhouse in 1977 from a man named Harold Doyle, who was dying and had no heirs. Harold Doyle had worked this land for 40 years and had discovered, in the process of digging a root cellar in the late 1960s, something he'd kept to himself. The southern portion of his property sat above a significant deposit of natural gas. Not an enormous field, but substantial. Real. Doyle was a quiet man who distrusted the energy companies he'd seen move into neighboring counties, buying land cheap from families who didn't know what they had, leaving behind contaminated water and broken agreements. He didn't want that for his land, so he told one person, my father, who was young and honest and had done right by him. My father spent 12 years surveying and documenting the deposit. He worked with an independent geologist, paid out of his own pocket, to get the analysis confirmed. He kept every record in this room underground because he didn't trust banks or lawyers or anyone who might move to claim what he'd found before he was ready. He had intended to pass this to me. Not Curtis. Not because Curtis was bad, but because, in my father's words, Curtis counts what things are worth. You understand what things cost. What a man gives up to hold onto something matters more than its price. I watched you hold onto Marcus after the accident. I watched you refuse to let him be just a loss. That's who this belongs to. I sat on the stone floor of that room for a long time. The rain had stopped. Above the open hatch, the clouds had broken just enough that I could see a strip of stars. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. I came up the ladder slow, lantern off. The front door was open. I hadn't latched it when I ran out in the storm. Standing in the entry hall, flashlight in hand, was Curtis. He looked at me. At the mud on my arms. At the lantern. Fen called me, he said. Said you'd been calling him about surveys and mineral rights. Fen had no business calling you. He called me because I asked him to keep me informed. Curtis's jaw was set. You've been out here 3 days, Eli. In a condemned house. What are you looking for? I looked at my brother for a long moment. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had learned that value was numerical, and that first place was the only place that mattered. My father had taught him that, in a different season of his life. A harder season. My father had taught us different things. I'm not looking for anything, I said. I found it. There's a version of this story where I become someone else's enemy. Where I cut Curtis out, run to lawyers, play the game the way it gets played. I thought about it. I won't pretend I didn't. But my father's letter, the last pages, the ones I haven't mentioned yet, had something specific to say about that. He wrote, I'm not leaving you a war, Eli. I'm leaving you a foundation. What you build on it is the answer to the question of who you are. I called Fen in the morning. He came out with a real estate and mineral rights attorney the following week. The geological reports were verified. The deposit was real. The land rights were clear. The farmhouse property, which sat fully within Hester County, had never been encumbered, surveyed for development, or claimed by any energy company. My father had protected it for 41 years. The initial valuation came back at something I am still not entirely comfortable speaking out loud. I'll say this, it was not $1. I told Curtis about it directly, before the lawyers did. He sat in his car in the gravel drive for 20 minutes. Then he got out and said he knew I'd have sold it in a week. Yeah, I said. You're not going to sell it. Not yet. Not like that. He nodded slowly. Something passed across his face that I don't have a word for. Not jealousy, exactly. More like a man suddenly understanding a long conversation he thought he'd already decoded. Here's what I want to tell you, before I tell you the end. I spent 3 weeks in that farmhouse before anyone came to help me restore it. I patched what I could by hand. I cleaned out 40 years of settled dust and bird nesting and the quiet accumulation of a place that had been waiting. I fixed the porch boards. I rehung the barn door. I found, in the trunk upstairs, which opened with the same iron key, a box of photographs. My father as a young man. My mother, before she left. Myself at age 6, sitting on a tractor, squinting into the sun. A photograph I had never seen, of my father holding Marcus, my son, as a baby, his face doing something I had never once seen it do. He looked like a man who understood what was precious. I kept that photograph. I framed it. It hangs in the farmhouse now, in the room I've started to repair for the weekends when my daughter comes to visit. There are people who will tell you that inheritance is just money. That what you're left says nothing about love, nothing about truth, nothing about who you were to the person who left it. I don't believe that anymore. My father left me $1 because he knew the room would laugh. He left it that way on purpose. He wanted to see who would stay in the chair after everyone else felt like they'd won. He wanted to know who would hold the address and the key and the iron weight of something unexplained and not throw it away. The Doyle farmhouse is no longer condemned. The surveys my father spent his life completing have been filed with the appropriate agencies. Negotiations are ongoing. I have an attorney who doesn't slide envelopes across tables without looking up. I have a daughter who is learning what an old barn smells like in the morning. And I have a photograph of my father holding my son who is gone but not lost, smiling in a way I only understood once I'd stood in a stone room underground with rain pouring through an open hatch above me, reading 4 pages that were always mine. My father never wasted a word in his life. It turned out the dollar bill wasn't a joke. It was the whole story folded up small. If stories of loss, buried truth, and second chances stay with you, subscribe. The next one is already waiting.